Is Dr. Amara Enyia, the Policy and Research Coordinator with the Movement for Black Lives. M4BL.org is the website, and Dr. Enyia's Twitter handle is at AMARA ENYIA. And Dr. Enyia, welcome to the program. Looking at this press release, it looks like you guys have put together just a jaw-dropping report on how, in particular, the Trump administration, but governments around the country have been just going after people associated with the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. Tell us about this.
Yeah, first, thank you so much for having me on to talk about this report. But it is really something to see. So the Movement for Black Lives worked with the CLEAR Clinic, and CLEAR is the Creating Law Enforcement Accountability and Responsibility Clinic at the City University of New York. Mm-hmm. And so they embarked on this study to really look at between August of 2020 and October. So the end of August, around August 30th to October 25th of 2020, we looked at the cases that were federalized, cases, individuals who have been charged after the uprisings, which took place throughout last summer and continuing afterward. But we looked at the cases to establish and to see a pattern where the federal government stepped in, essentially was engaged in overreach to federalize these charges, overstepping even local and state government to charge individuals who were involved in protests. And what we saw was quite troubling, although there is historical precedent for it. In many of these cases, of the 326 cases that we examined, we found that in a large percentage of those cases, around 72%, the mandatory minimums were involved. So this is where we start to talk about the connection between mass incarceration and the state intervening and federalizing charges in ways that ensure mandatory minimums for people, in ways that ensure that their federal charges, which come with a different set of consequences to it. And it was in particular those who were engaged in the uprisings last year after the murder of George Floyd. So it's a very troubling report in terms of what we found, but we also know that there's historical precedent for it.
Well, and there's a precedent kind of on the other side. I mean, for a long time, going back to the Kennedy era, actually, Robert Kennedy, mostly, post-assassination of John Kennedy, but Bobby as Attorney General, where when people were, for example, lynched or murdered, or somewhat smaller crimes, but state governments refused to prosecute or failed to convict, the federal government would step in and say, well, yes, that person is dead now. You weren't convicted of murdering them in court, even though obviously you're guilty, so we're going to convict you of depriving them of their civil right of life. And for years now, the Rush Limbaughs of the world have been moaning and groaning about the federal government stepping in when state governments fail to act. This is kind of along those lines, but a radical departure. I mean, that is done to ensure justice. This is being done to, I would say, corrupt justice. Can you clarify the distinction between these two types of federal, basically, preemption of state and local law?
Yeah, so in this case, it is done with the clear intent of instilling fear and pushing what would be essentially a chilling effect for those who are engaged in protests, particularly those who have been calling out systems of oppression, which is what happened last year. So in these instances, the federal government is actually getting involved to ensure that individuals are prosecuted with harsher sentences, to ensure that those sentences stick. So, for example, in federal cases, individuals are required to serve 85% of their sentence versus a state or local level. The federal government is essentially stepping in to make sure that there's a fear of actually engaging in protest, because if you are engaged in a protest and you get arrested, you will be the charges will be harsh, the consequences will be significant. And this has to be also considered alongside some of the legislation, anti-protest legislation that's been sweeping the country in the last year. We had dozens and dozens of bills that have been introduced by Republicans in state houses across the country. And one thing that really stands out is in one legislation, for example, in Florida, where they actually have reduced the sentencing for an individual who uses a vehicle to drive into protesters. Right. So they actually reduced the potential charges for that kind of infraction, while at the same time we're seeing that the federal government has federalized a lot of the charges against protesters who are involved in these uprisings for racial justice. And so this is the dynamic that's playing out. On the one hand, the state or the federal government is getting involved to suppress protests and to make sure that there are significant consequences for people exercising their First Amendment right. And also we have in state houses across the country, Republicans introducing legislation that reduces, for example, that suppresses the ability to protest, but does things like reducing charges for people who drive vehicles into crowds of protesters.
Right.
So this is the dynamic that we have.
So we're going to make it harder and less legal to exercise your First Amendment right to free speech and to petition your government for redress of grievance by collective action. We're going to diminish that right, and we're going to reduce the penalties for people who try to kill you when you are protesting by driving a car into your outfit. To what extent, we're talking with Dr. Amara Enyia, the Policy and Research Coordinator at the Movement for Black Lives, m4bl.org. Dr. Enyia, to what extent was this anomalous? To what extent was this something that came out of the Stephen Miller bowels of the Trump administration? I live in Portland, Oregon. We certainly saw it here, and there have been a bunch of federal prosecutions here in Portland of people who were convicted or are being prosecuted for federal crimes that had Trump not sent federal forces in, those people would be facing much lesser charges, shall we say, or fewer penalties for state or local charges, and frankly, I think more appropriately, the state or local charges. To what extent are you able to identify where this came from out of the Trump administration and presumably the Barr Justice Department? And has the pressure to do this from the executive branch diminished with the advent of the Biden administration?
Sure. So we certainly saw that the Trump administration became deeply involved through Attorney General at the time, Bill Barr. The first thing that happens is the language that is used to justify this move. So we saw that immediately after the uprisings began, all of a sudden, out of the White House, we were hearing about thugs, and these are out-of-state actors, and these are Antifa. So you start to see and start to hear this language that was coming out of the Trump administration, which is typically done to justify sending in federal forces so that they can actually begin to arrest and prosecute individuals that are exercising their First Amendment rights. And this isn't the first time. So, for example, we saw in 2017, you saw this new language, Black identity extremists, that the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which was formed primarily to focus on Al-Qaeda and other organizations of that sort. But then there was this phrase of Black identity extremists that became a target. And the reason that language was important is because it opened a door for the federal government to then justify overreach, to justify using the federal government to now prosecute individuals as a way of undermining these movements for racial justice and undermining people's ability to engage and to exercise their First Amendment rights.
Yeah, this is amazing stuff. You can read it all at m4bl.org. Is that the best website, Dr. Enyia?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Dr. Amara Enyia, the Policy and Research Coordinator with the Movement for Black Lives. Thank you so much for dropping by today. It's been great talking with you.